Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you are new here. In today's video I'm going to be offering you some tips and guidance on how you can pass your OSCE or your role play as a trainee psychological wellbeing practitioner. Just for a little bit of background, my name is Becky and I am currently a senior psychological wellbeing practitioner. I'm going to use the phrase PWP because otherwise it's quite a mouthful to say. So I am a senior PWP, and before I was in this role I was a qualified PWP for over 2 years, and I did have to do an OSCE in order to become a qualified PWP as part of my training. So these are going to be some tips that I personally found really helpful in order to pass my OSCE. As a disclaimer, these tips might not work for everybody and they're not going to guarantee that you will pass your OSCE. These are just tips that I've created based on what I found helpful, my own personal experience, and also based on feedback from the examiners as well. So I do hope that you find this video helpful. Now, if you are looking for advice or guidance on how to become a trainee PWP or how to get into that position, I have done a video already based on the application and the interviews. So if you want to view that video, then I will leave it linked below in the description box for you to have a look at. But this current video is based on the assumption that you are a trainee PWP. So you've gotten into that role, you've passed the application and the interview, you're currently on your training. That is the assumption that I have in mind when I'm making this video. And I'm also aware as well that a trainee PWP position is not the only position that has an OSCE. I know that as part of medical training or some other different healthcare professionals, an OSCE or a role play may be required in order for you to pass that training. So although I am speaking from the experience of somebody who's gone down the PWP route, I do hope that some of these tips can be generalised to other healthcare professional roles as well. That's my goal anyway. So firstly, let's jump straight into it and start off with what actually is an OSCE. So I believe OSCE stands for Objective Structured Clinical Examination, I think. And what it aims to do is assess your clinical competencies and your skills in practice. So it may require you to complete specific tasks that you would use in your clinical practice once you are that trained professional. So typically a PWP OSCE would require you to maybe carry out a treatment session with a client, or complete an assessment for a client, or to conduct a supervision session. Those are a few examples of the types of OSCEs or role plays that you could be expected to be examined on in an OSCE for a trainee PWP. Because those are things that you would carry out in your day-to-day life in that job role. So you would be doing really frequent treatment sessions, you would be doing assessments all the time as a PWP, and you would be attending supervision. So the OSCE just aims to examine what you would be like in those situations, basically. So an OSCE for a treatment session may require you to display clinical knowledge on the different types of interventions at the step 2 level. They may be looking to see how you set homework tasks with the client and how you encourage that engagement with them. They might be assessing you on how you deliver psychoeducation and describe the rationale of an intervention. However, an assessment OSCE may be requiring you to gather information, so they might be looking at your information gathering skills. They might be looking to see how you gain rapport with the client and how you use your interpersonal skills in a session. And in an assessment as well, they may be looking to see how you display your clinical judgment and how you can determine what treatment option would be the best for that client's presentation. So for example, it might be a case of the client has displayed to you that they have negative automatic thoughts about themselves and the world around them, and this is causing symptoms of depression and making them feel very low in mood. So from that, you could use your clinical judgment to determine that, okay, maybe a step 2 intervention might be helpful. Maybe they could look at some cognitive restructuring techniques. And then in the assessment, you can deliver that rationale to the client and display the purpose of the treatment that they would be going forward for as well. However, in a treatment session, OSCE, you might be looking at how you deliver cognitive restructuring to that client. So what psychoeducation is necessary? How do you talk through the techniques and the tools with them? How do you set the between session tasks? Normally, all types of OSCE would assess you on some sort of risk as well. So don't panic when I say that. They're not going to be asking you to deal with a very complex case of risk. Then they normally won't have somebody in there where you would be required to call the emergency services if it was that level of risk. What I've found in terms of the many role plays that I've completed and the OSCE that I passed is that they tend to just be looking at your exploration skills and your information gathering skills. So for example, my client in the OSCE displayed that they had experienced some thoughts of risk of harm to self. And although it wasn't urgent, they were assessing me on how do I explore that further? What types of questions do I ask? How do I get that information from the client that is of a sensitive nature? That's all that they were assessing me on risk. However, if I didn't ask about risk, then it was an automatic fail. So even if I'd completed the rest of the session brilliantly and I did a really great job at everything else, if I didn't ask about risk, it would be an automatic fail. So just ask the question, just ask that client, within the past couple of weeks, have you had any thoughts to end your life or to harm yourself? Just ask that question and you are already one step ahead. What I will say is read the description carefully for the OSCE. So you know exactly what type of session it is that you are carrying out. So are you delivering an assessment? Are you delivering a treatment session? Are you attending a supervision session? And have a look at the clinical competencies that they are looking for. So my marking criteria was set out in terms of more therapeutic skills. So like interpersonal skills, rapport with the client, the engagement from the client. And then they were looking at more like practical skills as well. So like the time management, how do I stick to the agenda? How do I bring the client back if they're, going off on a tangent? So have a look at the description of your OSCE, and if they provide you with the marking criteria, then use that as your checklist. Not every service or university will give you the marking criteria. However, mine did, and I used that as gospel, basically. I just used it as my checklist, and I had it next to me in the OSCE, and I would just glance down every so often and just make sure that I was kind of ticking things off as I was going along. And whatever the type of session your OSCE is based on, always ask yourself, what is the purpose of this session and what am I trying to achieve here as well? So for example, in an assessment, I know that the purpose is that I am trying to gather the appropriate information about the client's difficulties so that we can come to an agreed conclusion on what the most appropriate treatment would be for them and the next steps. So that's just an example. So when you get told what session it is that you are delivering your OSCE on, just ask yourself, what would be the whole purpose of this session? What would I be trying to achieve? And then again, that is the first step. You are one step ahead there towards passing your OSCE. So just a few little tips that I would recommend maybe on the build up to the OSCE, just to help you be better prepared. So firstly, role play. Role play so much with your colleagues, with your supervisor, with other trainee PWPs in your cohort, with your family. So I would role play every week with another trainee who was on the course with me. So we would take it in turns to role play and practice our OSCEs together. That was extremely helpful. You could also have a third person in there as well who would act as the marker. So you would have the person who is, delivering the session, then you would have the person who plays as the client, and then you'd have the person there who would be going through the marking criteria and telling you what parts you've hit, what parts you haven't hit, how you could improve, that kind of thing. Practice with your supervisor or in clinical skills. That's a very, very good way to utilise those sessions. They are there for you. At the moment, I am responsible for supporting the trainees that we have in the service, and they like to use clinical skills for role play. Even after they pass their OSCEs, they like to just use the sessions to practice delivering interventions or asking difficult questions. There might be a specific part of a session that you are concerned about the most. You know, it might be you don't really know how to ask about risk. So you can bring that to a clinical skills session and just practice role playing it. That is the best way to become more comfortable before you're doing the real thing. I also practiced on my partner at the time, who is now my husband. I would practice my OSCE on him a lot. I would basically tell him, so my OSCE was to do an assessment, so I would basically ask him to just picture in his head a problem, a mental health issue. It could be anything, and we did this about 3 times, I think, and he did come up with a different presentation each time. So that was great because he was a very objective way to assess my rapport with the client. So although he didn't know what therapeutic skills I was trying to put in there, or you know, he didn't know what I'd been trained in or what I was training in, he doesn't know anything about the psychological interventions. He is not a psychologist. He does not know anything like that, but he could tell me what was my engagement like with the client. How did I make him feel? Did I make him feel comfortable? Did I make him feel like he was in a safe space where he could share this information with me? Did I ask the questions in an appropriate way? Was I too abrupt? Was I too direct? So that was a great way of being able to just see how a client would feel. So although I absolutely dreaded role plays and I did not enjoy doing them, it was so helpful in order for me to pass my OSCE. So I would highly recommend that you role play as much as you can in the build up to your OSCE. I would also recommend that you have a template. Have I said that word right? Template? I'm overthinking the word and now I can't remember how to pronounce it. I'm sure you know what I mean. Now please do not make this template too long or waffly, because it doesn't matter whether you are face to face in the room with the examiners or whether you are doing it over Zoom, they will be able to tell if you are reading off a script. It's just so noticeable if you are reading a script word for word, and it will sound robotic. So please don't do that. But what I would recommend is that you do have maybe like a Word document or a notepad in front of you that just has key words on it, just so you can stick to an agenda and you know what you're trying to ask or what you're trying to achieve from the session and the points that you need to cover. So for example, for me, like I said earlier, my OSCE was an assessment session, so I'm pretty sure I just started off mine with saying, introduce self, ask preferred name, purpose of session, how much time we have, confidentiality, any questions before we get started. And that was my introduction session done, so that kind of ticked all the boxes that I felt like I needed for the introduction. And then for the next part of my template, I just had the 4 W's. So by that I mean what, when, where, and with whom. So those were the questions that I were going to ask along those lines in order to get the client's main problem. So what is the problem? Where does it happen? When does it happen? And with whom is it better or worse? So just those 4 W's can be very powerful in order to get that information, but it's not too chunky on the template. They're very easy to glance at. And then underneath that, I had something very similar to the 5 areas model, which we do use a lot in cognitive behavioural therapy, which is a very helpful way to gain information from a client about their presenting problem and can also help them to see how different parts of their problem interact with other areas too. So I had a section that said situation/triggers, feelings/emotions, physical symptoms, behaviours, thoughts. Pretty sure that was it. I could glance at that and be like, oh, so you've told me that you're feeling low. When you feel that way, what thoughts go through your mind? What is this triggered by? What situations do you notice feeling that way the most in? When you're feeling low, do you notice any physical symptoms? Does it make you do more or less of anything? So then you're looking at the behavioural changes. So those are just some very brief parts of a template that can actually be really, really useful. And it also just helps to give you a prompt if you feel your mind going blank. So if you get to a point where you're thinking, I don't know what to ask next, I don't know what to say, you can glance at your template, you could look at the word thoughts, for example, and think, I've not asked them what they're thinking about, I've not asked them about cognitions, so that's the next point that I'm going to ask them. You can also use the 4Ws for the risk section as well. So if somebody discloses thoughts to harm themselves, you could then go through the, what do the thoughts say, when do they happen, where do they happen, with whom, is it better or worse, that kind of thing. And with risk as well, you'd also be asking about like how often, so the frequency, and then you'd also be asking about the intensity of them. So, how much intention do you have to act on those thoughts? And I suppose a little bit more about risk, you would also be looking at what the client can do to confirm their safety. So, what protective factors do they have? What keeps them safe? What techniques do they have that are quite useful for them in those moments? Like, is there anything that distracts them from those thoughts? So with risk, not only would you be looking at gathering the information, but you'd also just be looking at how could you confirm their safety, basically. And it might just be a case of asking them, do you feel like you can keep yourself safe whilst you're on a waiting list for like 3 months, for example? And they can confirm or deny. And then you could also just offer them some contact numbers, or if you don't know the 24/7 support numbers that are available, you could direct the client to go back to their GP if they felt like their risk had increased. So a statement like that can be really helpful because you don't have to do too much, but you've confirmed their safety and you've also allowed the client to see what their options are if they do feel like they are at risk of harm to themselves or somebody else. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about like the interpersonal skills that are important, or that I found were important for my OSCE, because these are just some nice things to throw in there that can help get your mark up a bit higher. And I found that some of these I got marked quite well on, and I think they might have been the reason why I passed, because there were other areas that I didn't do so well on, but then a lot of my interpersonal skills like bumped my score up and got me over into that pass boundary. So for example, you may be assessed on your ability to show that you've listened, so your listening skills, and you can do that through summarising, paraphrasing, reflecting back to the client. So after they've described their experiences to you, before you move on to talking about treatment options and the next steps going forward, you could summarise back to them what you've heard just to make sure you've understood. So for example, it could be, so what I've heard is blah, blah, blah. Is that correct? Or have I understood properly there? Does that sound about right? Or you might also want to ask somebody, could you expand on that please? So you've told me blah, blah, blah. I'm interested in learning more about that. Would you be able to expand on that please? Tools like that are also really helpful for if you have a client who's being quite vague. So my client was somebody who was quite vague, was giving yes or no answers, didn't really want to reveal too much. So I think that I was being assessed on how I could get that information out of somebody who maybe wasn't too willing to share, and how I could build up that rapport and engagement with them. So what I found really helpful was to use open questions, not closed questions. So that meant that their answers didn't really have the opportunity to be restricted. So I wasn't asking them questions where they could answer yes or no. I was asking them very specific, open questions where they had to answer it directly. So for example, what triggers your anxiety? When have you noticed feeling anxious? They can't answer yes or no to that, and even if they answer with one word, so for example, work, you've got some information. You've gathered that their work situations trigger their anxiety. So, you've got something from them. But even questions like, would you be able to expand on that please? Or I'm interested in learning more about that. Can we discuss that for a little bit more time? Or things like that can all help them to gradually start to open up a little bit more if they're somebody who doesn't feel completely comfortable in the OSCE. And I think as well, one thing that I found really, really helpful, both in my OSCE, but also in my actual clinical practice with clients, is that if somebody is being quite vague, or if you can tell that they are feeling discomfort through the conversation, to offer empathy statements. So for example, that must be really difficult for you. I can't imagine how hard that must have been. Or saying, it's understandable that you feel that way based on your circumstances. That's completely understandable. So I'm not saying that I understand, I'm not saying I completely get what they're going through. I've not experienced what they've experienced, but I can see why they would feel that way. And then my final tip regarding your OSCE is to be prepared to reflect on it. So what I found was, not only did the examiners want me to complete the OSCE correctly, they wanted me to also reflect on it afterwards. So what I would recommend is that as soon as you come out of your OSCE, as soon as you've finished, literally get a piece of paper, split it halfway down in the middle. On one side, write 3 of the strengths. So immediately, what 3 things came to mind that you did well in that OSCE? And then on the other side, what were your 3 weaknesses, or what 3 things do you think that you didn't do so well on, or that you need to improve on? And do that when you come fresh out of the OSCE, before you've had time to overthink anything, because trust me, your mind will probably go into a spiral after the OSCE whilst you're waiting for your results. So do that as you come out of it immediately. Just 3 things you did well, 3 things you didn't. And it could be anything. So it could be, I kept well to time. I completed the assessment within the 45 minutes that I was allocated. So that might be your strength. Because timing is really important as well. That's not one to be overlooked. They want to see how you can keep to a schedule and an agenda, and how you can complete the necessary parts of the assessment within the allocated time that you have. And same with treatment sessions as well. They want to see how you fit it all into the time limit. Now, the reason why it's important to write those 6 items down, 3 on one side, 3 on the other, is because after my OSCE, I had to do a reflective essay all about my performance in the OSCE and how I felt I did, and the things that I could take from it going forward, and how I could use it to improve my clinical practice. However, I also know of some training courses which will ask you straight away. So they might ask you, what do you think went well? What do you think that didn't go so well? And they will write your answers down on the marking criteria. So there might be a section on their marking criteria about how you can reflect kind of on your own clinical practice. So that's important as well. So just bear that in mind. I know that that's not a tip on how to pass your OSCE whilst you're doing it, but that's something that's really important to just be aware of when you come out of the OSCE, is that you are probably going to be asked to reflect on your own performance, and that is normal for a training course. You might just want to see how you would utilise supervision in those circumstances. So for example, if you've identified your weaknesses, you could then say, oh, but I would bring this up in supervision or clinical skills, or I'd do some more role plays to try and overcome that, like I mentioned earlier. So something along that wavelength. So in order to summarise, I do think that my main tips in a nutshell for completing your OSCE would firstly be to role play in the build up to your OSCE, really practice as much as you can. Have a short, brief template with the necessary things that you are trying to get from that session. So the things that you need to cover, but do not ramble in this template. Don't have it as a script, just a structure really. Keep to time, so you can also use your template to keep to time, because you'll know how much time I have left, how much I have left to cover on my template, therefore I need to get a move on, that kind of thing. Remember to ask about risk, but don't overthink it. Maybe just have one question that you would use to start off your risk section. And interpersonal skills. So for this one, remember to include empathy statements. Remember to summarise back to the client to make sure you've understood. Remember to show them that you have listened, and remember to be compassionate with them and let them know that they are going through a difficult time. So those would be like my top tips for helping you pass your OSCE in a nutshell. Now, I know that that was a lot of information, and OSCE is difficult to pass, so if you do not pass it first time, remember that is completely normal. Lots of people do not pass their OSCEs first time. They are hard. But if you do have any further questions at all about anything I might have missed out, any specific questions about the OSCE, or about my experiences as a trainee, as a qualified PWP, or as a senior, please feel free to leave your comments and questions down below underneath the video. I think it's under the video where you can leave those comments. Or you're more than welcome to DM me on Instagram. I will leave the link to my Instagram in the description box, so you're more than welcome to message me or leave any comments. And what I will say as well is, once you've completed your OSCE, give yourself a break. Do something nice for you. It is hard, it's really stressful. I did not enjoy doing my OSCE, I did not enjoy the build up to it. Everybody was panicking, it was a very chaotic time. So I do wish you the best of luck, but also cut yourself some slack and give yourself a break afterwards, regardless of if you feel like it went well or if you feel like it went terribly. Cut yourself some slack, give yourself a little bit of a break afterwards, you do deserve it. Give this video a thumbs up if you found it helpful, and if you want to see more from me, you are more than welcome to subscribe. It is free and it lets you know every time I upload a video. Like I mentioned earlier, I also have a video on how to become a trainee PWP, so the link for that will be in the description box as well if you are interested on how to get into this position where you have to do an OSCE in the first place. I will see you next time, or rather you'll see me, and I hope you have a lovely day. See you soon.